The photograph was discovered on a damp October afternoon, buried beneath a pile of rotting newspapers in the corner of a long-abandoned farmhouse. Dust clung to its edges like ash, and the air around it felt unnervingly colder, as though something inside the picture still breathed. It showed a family of 5 posed stiffly in their Sunday clothes, the kind of portrait meant to be cherished, framed, and passed down for generations. But this one had been left to decay in a house the world had tried to forget. At first glance, nothing about the image seemed unusual. The mother's hands folded neatly over her lap. The father standing stiff and formal. The 2 older children expressionless, the way people often appeared in old photographs. But there was something odd about the youngest child, that pale, thin figure standing slightly apart from the rest, positioned near the tall window that looked out into the encroaching woods. The child's head was turned just enough to suggest they were about to glance back at the photographer, yet their eyes weren't directed at the camera at all. They were looking past it, as if watching someone, moving silently within the dark tree line outside. The longer the historian stared at the boy's face, the more unsettling it became. There was tension in the jaw, delicate but unmistakable, as if the child were holding back a scream. And though it made no logical sense, the historian felt certain he had seen those eyes before, not in another photograph, but somewhere in the woods themselves, watching him from between the trees the day he first approached the house. A faint breeze slid through the broken windows, rustling the peeling wallpaper, and the historian felt suddenly exposed, as though the forest outside had leaned closer. He held the photograph at arm's length, trying to shake off the feeling, but that was when he noticed something else, something his mind had somehow missed until now. In the reflection of the window behind the child, another figure stood. Not tall, not human-shaped, but unmistakably there. And the reflection of the child wasn't matching the child at all. The historian froze, pulse hammering. Whatever stood outside that window in 1910, whatever the child had seen, had not left these woods. And now, it knew he had found the picture. Key point number 1 unfolds with a quiet tension that grows steadily heavier as the historian steps into the abandoned farmhouse, unaware that he is about to discover something that will consume his thoughts and unravel his sense of reality. The building sits deep within the woods, half swallowed by vines and leaning slightly, as though the forest has been trying for years to pull it back into the earth. The historian enters not out of thrill but out of habit, following a fading trail of rural architecture for an upcoming book. The floor creaks under his weight, dust motes swirl through thin shafts of light, and the scent of mildew hangs thick in the air. Everything about the house is silent in an unnatural, breath-held way, as if even the insects have learned not to stir here. He moves through the room slowly, taking notes on the peeling wallpaper patterns, the charred outline of an old fireplace, the rusted nails where portraits once hung. It is only when he reaches a small back room that he notices a stack of old newspapers melting into the floorboards from years of moisture. Something beneath them catches his eye, a corner of something sturdier, something rectangular, something preserved. He crouches and gently lifts the fading papers, revealing a thin photograph coated in grime, the edges curled from time and neglect. The moment his fingers brush against it, a shiver climbs up his wrist, as if the image carries a temperature of its own. He wipes it carefully with his sleeve, revealing the faces of a family posed in stiff, early 20th century formality. He knows enough about photography to immediately recognize the date range, about 1905 to 1915, but it is the condition of the photograph that puzzles him. While everything else in the house has succumbed to rot, this picture looks disproportionately intact. Almost protected. As he studies the expressions, he feels something stir deep in his mind, a strange heaviness, as though the picture is slowly pressing itself into his memory. The father stands with rigid pride, the mother sits with a practiced stillness, the older children carry vacant gazes typical of the era. But even at this early glance, his attention is pulled toward the youngest child at the very edge of the frame, near the long window that opens toward the woods outside. There is something off, he can't explain it yet, but the placement feels wrong, the posture a little too tense, the eyes not directed toward the camera but somewhere past it. The historian tells himself it is simply curiosity, nothing more than the natural fascination that accompanies any unusual discovery. Yet as he slips the photograph into his bag, he feels the house grow colder. Not by a breeze or shift in weather, but by a pressure that suggests something in the walls resents him for taking it. The moment the historian sits in his small rented cabin to examine the photograph more closely, the unease he felt inside the farmhouse returns with sharper edges, as if the picture has carried a fragment of that cold air with it. He places the photo under a desk lamp, letting the warm light reveal details that were muted by dirt and age. The family member's faces come into clearer focus, but his eyes are drawn again, irresistibly, to the youngest child standing beside the tall window. There is something unnervingly rigid about the child's stance, as though they were frozen mid-movement rather than posed deliberately. The historian leans closer, narrowing his eyes at the faint sheen of the glass behind the child, and that is when he notices the reflection. At first, his mind tries to explain it as a trick of light or damage to the photograph, but the more he studies it, the more undeniable it becomes. The reflection of the child in the window does not mirror the child's pose. While the real child faces slightly toward the camera, the reflection is turned fully toward the woods outside, as if reacting to something behind the photographer. Even stranger is the expression. The actual child appears blank, the typical expressionless look common in early photographs, but the reflection shows a face tightened with fear, eyes wide and alert, lips parted as though in mid-warning. It is such a stark contrast that the historian instinctively pulls back, his breath catching in his throat. He adjusts the lamp, angles the photograph differently, even rubs at the glassy surface, telling himself that smudges or scratches might be distorting the image. But every adjustment only makes the discrepancy clearer. The child's reflection is not only different, it appears older. There is a maturity in the contours of the face, a slight lengthening of the jaw, and a sharper definition around the eyes that could not belong to a child of that size. It is as if the reflection belongs to the same person but several years ahead, caught in a moment of terror the real child has not yet experienced. The historian feels an uncomfortable tightening in his chest, a sensation like the room shrinking around him. He tries to rationalize it as an optical illusion created by age, moisture, or poor early photography techniques, but deep down he knows this explanation doesn't hold. The reflection is too deliberate, too precise in its fear. For a long moment, he simply stares at the photograph, aware of the faint sound of wind brushing against the cabin walls. The woods outside seem to lean into the silence. The historian cannot shake the unsettling sense that the reflection is not just showing him something wrong with the photograph, it is trying to show him something that terrified the child, something still out there in the shadows beyond the window, something that did not belong in the year 1910 but lingered long enough to be captured in the glass. When the historian decides to identify the family in the photograph, he believes it will be a simple archival task, the kind he has done countless times before. The region where the farmhouse is located has been sparsely populated for generations, with well-preserved records stored in a small county office that rarely sees visitors. Confident that he can uncover the family's name, origins, and fate, he begins his research early the next morning, carrying the photograph with him as though it were a fragile piece of evidence in an unsolved case. The clerk at the office is helpful but puzzled when the historian presents the photo. She recognizes the style of clothing and the likely decade but cannot recall any local family that matches the faces. Still, she retrieves the county registry books, thick with handwritten entries from the late 1800s and early 1900s. The historian flips through pages marked by time and ink fading into sepia, expecting at any moment to find the surname that will lead him to birth certificates, land deeds, or even a record of taxes. But no matter how carefully he reads, the entries for the year 1910 contain no record of a family of 5 living anywhere near the woods where the farmhouse stands. He broadens his search to earlier years, tracing back to 1895, hoping the family may have moved to the area later. Again, nothing. It is as though the family never existed. The clerk notices his growing frustration and brings out a more detailed census book, a meticulously kept volume that should list every resident of the county by household. Together they scan the entries line by line, but the pages jump from one known surname to another without any mention of a family matching the photograph. The historian asks to review land ownership records next, focusing on the plot where the farmhouse still stands. This should offer certainty. Every piece of land has an owner recorded, even if a family vanishes or loses their property. But the land file is strangely incomplete. The earliest deed lists the property as a government-claimed parcel, marked only as woodland, without any recorded structure. The clerk frowns, stating that houses built around that time typically have at least some documentation, even if handwritten by local officials. The historian digs deeper, requesting older ledgers stored in the basement archives. Dust rises as the boxes are opened, revealing lists of transactions, marriages, deaths, and property taxes. Yet the absence persists. Every trace of the family, birth records, school rosters, church registries, even burial records, is missing. By the time he leaves the county office, a cold unease weighs on him. People may forget families, but documents do not. Records do not simply vanish. The historian cannot shake the feeling that something intentionally erased them, not by accident or neglect, but by design, as if the family's existence itself had been swallowed whole by the same woods staring back from the photograph. The historian's search for answers leads him deeper into the small community surrounding the woods, a place where houses sit far apart and generations of families have inherited the same land, the same stories, and the same quiet fears. After finding no official records of the family, he begins asking locals if they know anything about the farmhouse or the people who once lived there. Most respond with polite confusion or disinterest, but a few react differently, hesitating, glancing toward the tree-line, or simply refusing to speak. The deeper he probes, the more he senses an unspoken tension shared by those who have lived near the woods their entire lives. Eventually, an older man at a roadside diner leans in and tells him he's asking the wrong questions, not because there are no answers, but because some answers aren't meant to be dug up. Intrigued rather than discouraged, the historian insists, and the man reluctantly mentions an old name once given to the forest, the borrowing trees. The way he says it carries a weight that makes the air feel still, as though the phrase itself should not be spoken at full volume. He explains that the name dates back long before the farmhouse was built, passed down from settlers who first lived near the woods. They claimed that the forest had a strange pull on children, especially those who wandered too close at dusk. There were stories of youngsters who would pause mid-step, as if hearing someone call their name from between the trees, though no voice was heard by anyone else. Some swore they saw shapes, a pale hand withdrawing behind a trunk or a figure retreating just beyond reach. Over the years, a pattern had formed in the old tales, children disappearing without a trace, sometimes after claiming they saw someone who looked just like them watching from the trees. These were whispered stories, shared only during storms or around campfires, never written down and rarely acknowledged in daylight. The older man insists they are nothing more than folklore, but his trembling fingers on the coffee cup suggest he does not fully believe his own disclaimer. He warns the historian that those woods hold things that cannot be explained by history or research, things that mimic, lure, and borrow. When the historian presses for more, the man abruptly ends the conversation, telling him that people stopped building homes near the forest for a reason. As the historian leaves the diner, he looks toward the distant line of trees swaying gently in the breeze. The woods seem peaceful on the surface, but the weight of the locals' fear clings to him. He begins to wonder whether the child in the photograph had been watching something that only children could see, something the adults in the picture were unaware of, something the community has avoided naming for over a century. Back in the abandoned farmhouse, the historian feels drawn to search deeper, driven by a mixture of dread and curiosity that has become impossible to ignore. The photograph has already revealed enough to unsettle him, yet he senses there is more hidden within the house, something left behind intentionally or perhaps something the family never had the chance to collect. The farmhouse interior is dim, the broken windows allowing just enough light to cast long, uneasy shadows across the floorboards. He moves slowly, the air thick with the scent of damp wood and decay, until he reaches a small dresser wedged against the wall. Its drawers are swollen from years of moisture, but after several attempts he manages to force the top one open. Inside are scraps of fabric, a rusted button, and a brittle ribbon tied in a child's knot. The second drawer is harder to open, almost as if something inside is resisting. When he finally forces it, the wood protests with a sharp crack. At first glance, it holds nothing but dust and a few crumbled papers. But tucked tightly against the back panel, nearly hidden beneath years of debris, is a photograph so well preserved it seems untouched by time. His breath catches as he pulls it out. It is unmistakably the same family, same clothes, same expressions, same arrangement. Except one detail is drastically different. The child who stood by the window in the first photograph is gone. Not moved, not blurred, not shifted, gone entirely, as though never present during the moment the second picture was taken. The absence feels unnatural. The space where the child should be is not empty, it carries a strange distortion, a faint warp in the background as if something had been hastily erased or had slipped out of the frame before the camera captured it. The historian studies the parents' expressions, the older siblings' positions, searching for any sign of reaction, but none of them indicate the sudden disappearance of the youngest. Their faces remain composed, unaware, unchanged between the two images. It is as though the family posed twice in quick succession, but in the span of those seconds, the child was removed from reality entirely. He compares the photographs side by side under the faint light creeping through the broken window. It makes no sense for a family to pose with 5 members one moment and appear with only 4 the next, unless the second picture was taken long after the child's disappearance, but the clothing, the lighting, and even the angle are identical. The historian feels a chill crawl up his spine as he realizes the second photograph was likely captured just seconds after the first. Whatever stood outside that window, the thing reflected behind the child's frightened gaze, had taken no time at all. The historian cannot shake the feeling that the photographs are hiding more than what is visible to the naked eye. Back at his cabin, he sets both images on the table and brings out his laptop, determined to enhance the details as much as possible. Darkness has fallen outside, and the woods surrounding the cabin are nothing but a solid black wall pressed against the windows. The air feels unnaturally still, but he forces himself to focus on the task. As he scans the first photograph and zooms in on the area behind the child, he adjusts the contrast, sharpness, and shadows, each small enhancement pulling details out of the murky background. At first, it seems like nothing more than a tangle of branches and undergrowth. But as the image clears, shapes begin to emerge, shapes that do not belong to any natural landscape. He leans in closer, heart thudding. What looked like random patterns of light and shadow begins to align into faint outlines of human-like forms standing between the trees. They are not fully visible, more like silhouettes pressed into the darkness, their features too blurred to distinguish but unmistakably watching from the woods. The historian tells himself this must be pareidolia, the mind's tendency to create patterns out of randomness. But the more he adjusts the image, the more defined the shapes become. One figure seems slightly taller than the others, its head tilted as though observing the family with an unnatural stillness. Another, shorter and more distorted, appears closer to the window, almost leaning forward as if trying to see the child more clearly. None of them have the softened edges of natural shadows, their outlines have intention, posture, and presence. A creeping dread settles in his chest as he begins enhancing the second photograph. The child is still missing, the distortion in the window now looking painfully intentional, almost as if something had moved so fast it smeared the air behind it. But it is the forest outside that truly unsettles him. The silhouettes are still there, only this time they appear closer, clearer, their shapes sharper and more defined. He enhances the shadows further and sees what appears to be elongated fingers resting against a tree trunk, almost blending into the bark. Another shape seems to have a faint outline of eyes, darkened pits that stare through the glass as if aware of being observed even decades after the photograph was taken. The historian sits back, breath unsteady. He glances at the window beside him, half expecting to see similar shadows forming outside. The woods surrounding his cabin feel too quiet, too heavy with expectation. For the first time since starting this investigation, he senses that the photograph was never meant to be found. And the figures hidden among the trees were never meant to be seen, not then and certainly not now. Returning to the farmhouse after analyzing the photographs, the historian feels a tension in the air that was not present before, as though the house itself has become alert to his presence. The woods around him seem to lean inward, branches arching overhead like silent witnesses to his every step. He tells himself he is imagining it, a result of staring too long at distorted shapes in old pictures. Still, the unease lingers at the back of his mind as he pushes open the warped door and steps inside. The air is colder now, heavy with the scent of damp soil and something faintly metallic, like rust or old blood. Dust drifts lazily in the pale light filtering through the broken windows, and each creak of the floorboards echoes just a little too loudly, as if the house is responding to him. He walks through the rooms with measured steps, trying to retrace where everything had been found. The photograph drawer, the collapsed shelves, the peeling wallpaper curling like dried skin. But today, something feels different. The silence is too absolute, thick enough to press against his ears. It is the kind of silence that suggests listening rather than absence. He pauses near the window, the same window where the child once stood, and looks out toward the dense trees beyond the clearing. The forest is motionless, every branch frozen in place as though holding its breath. It is then, just as he turns away, that he hears it. A small, trembling voice, so faint it could be mistaken for a distant breeze. But the sound is unmistakable. It whispers his name. At first, he thinks it must be an auditory illusion, the mind's response to isolation and fear. But the voice comes again, slightly clearer, as if straining to reach him from far away. It is not the voice of an adult. It is the soft, fragile voice of a child. Every hair on the back of his neck rises. He feels rooted to the spot, unable to move, unable to breathe normally. The voice drifts through the room like a thin thread of air, too delicate to locate yet too real to deny. It carries a note of desperation, as though calling him is an act of last resort. The historian forces himself to speak, his voice cracking against the suffocating stillness, asking who is there. But the house gives no answer. Only the faint echo of his own voice returns. The silence feels thicker now, almost oppressive, as though the house is waiting for something. Then he hears the voice again, closer this time, right behind him, barely louder than a whisper yet sharp enough to freeze his blood. It says his name once more, lingering on the last syllable as if pleading. When he turns, the room is empty. But the cold that surrounds him feels unmistakably like the presence of someone small, terrified, and unseen, standing only inches away. The historian's pulse is still unsteady from hearing the child's whisper when he realizes he can no longer ignore the sense that the house is guiding him, nudging him toward something hidden yet urgently waiting to be found. The air feels heavier with each step he takes, as if the walls themselves are saturated with memory. He returns to the room where the photographs were discovered, the floorboards creaking faintly underfoot. He scans the space carefully, noting every shadow, every loose plank, every oddly shaped piece of debris. Something inside him insists that the house has not yet revealed everything it holds. A chill crawls through the air as he moves toward a section of flooring slightly warped, the wood bending inward just enough to suggest age or pressure. When he kneels and presses his palm against it, he feels a faint hollow beneath. He hesitates, wondering if disturbing it is wise, but curiosity outweighs fear. Using a rusted tool he found earlier, he pries up the plank, and a thin, stale draft rises from the opening. Inside, he finds a narrow space between the subflooring and foundation, filled with dust, scraps of cloth, and something folded carefully, deliberately. His heart hammers as he reaches down and retrieves the object, a yellowed piece of paper, brittle but intact, small enough to have been hidden by a child's hand. He unfolds it slowly, the delicate fibers crackling at the edges. The handwriting is uneven, the letters large and hesitant, unmistakably written by someone young. But the message sends a deep tremor through him. In faint, trembling strokes it reads, "Don't look outside after they knock." The historian stares at the words, trying to steady his breathing, trying to understand what kind of fear drives a child to leave behind a warning like this. He turns the paper over, hoping for context, a date, a name, anything. But there is nothing except a faint smudge, possibly a fingerprint too small to belong to an adult. His gaze drifts toward the window instinctively, and for a moment he imagines a small figure crouched here long ago, listening to something moving outside in the dark. The idea of knocking, gentle or violent, playful or menacing, echoes in his mind, each variation worse than the last. The historian tries to reason with himself. Perhaps the note was part of a game, a child's dramatic imagination scribbled during a storm. But the trembling handwriting carries panic, not playfulness. And the placement under the floorboards suggests secrecy, urgency, and a desperate attempt to leave a message that adults might never find. As he kneels there, the note trembling in his hands, the quiet inside the farmhouse shifts subtly, almost imperceptibly. It is the kind of silence that follows movement, not absence. And for the first time, he wonders if the child who wrote the warning had been hiding from something that still knows this house, still remembers the family, and still expects someone to answer if it knocks. The historian has spent countless hours poring over photographs, notes, and local lore, yet nothing prepares him for what begins to happen as night falls in the farmhouse. The sun has long disappeared behind the dense woods, and the house is swallowed in shadows so deep they seem to press against the walls from every corner. He moves carefully from room to room, retracing the steps where the photographs and hidden note were found, but the air is different now, heavier, and vibrating with a quiet, almost imperceptible motion. At first, he dismisses it as the settling of old wood, the familiar creaks and groans of a structure long abandoned. Then he notices something more deliberate. Footsteps. Soft, careful, and circling the house, coming from the direction of the tree-line. They are slow, rhythmic, and impossibly measured, as if the entity behind them knows exactly where he is and what he is doing. His pulse quickens, and he freezes, straining to listen. The steps move along the perimeter of the farmhouse, stopping precisely at the window where the child once stood in the photograph. They pause there, lingering, and then continue, only to return moments later. The repetition carries a weight, an intention, and it is accompanied by a subtle vibration in the floor, almost imperceptible but undeniably present. The historian feels an icy draft brush against the back of his neck. He turns slowly, scanning the window and the darkened woods beyond. The forest is a solid mass of shadow, but the edges of the trees seem to shift slightly, as though something is pressing against the branches, moving between them with deliberate caution. The pattern of footsteps mirrors the circling, patient rhythm of whatever is out there, tracing him, observing him, and stopping only at the spot where the child once stood over a century ago. The thought strikes him that this is no mere haunting or trick of the imagination. This is the continuation of a presence that has endured decades, waiting for anyone to trespass into the history it guards. He moves closer to the window, heart hammering, half expecting to see the faint silhouette of the child's reflection from the photograph. The night outside is thick and still, yet the sensation of being watched intensifies with every passing second. Every step beyond the farmhouse seems to echo inside the house itself, a faint tremor that reverberates through the floorboards and walls. The historian feels the oppressive weight of the forest pressing inward, as if the trees themselves are alive, moving with an intelligence, ensuring that the window remains a point of focus, a threshold between him and whatever still lingers in the dark. Hours pass, or perhaps minutes, time seems irrelevant, and the footsteps continue, circling, pausing, returning again to the same window. The historian realizes with a growing chill that this is not a random disturbance, not the creaks of an old house, nor the wind playing tricks among the trees. The presence that walks these woods, unseen and patient, is bound to the window where the child once stood. It remembers. It waits. And it has marked him as the next observer, the next witness to whatever terrors remain hidden just beyond the glass. By the time the historian begins to doubt his own senses, the night around the farmhouse has deepened into a heavy, almost tangible darkness, the kind that presses against the windows and seeps under doors. He sits near the window where the child once stood, photographs and notes scattered around him, the flickering beam of his lantern struggling to hold back the shadows. Outside, the forest is a solid black mass, the trees looming like silent sentinels, yet the rhythmic circling of footsteps he had heard before seems closer now, more deliberate, almost impatient. He leans against the sill, staring at the faint reflection cast by the lantern, trying to convince himself that his own reflection is all there is, a mundane reassurance in a house that seems determined to unnerve him. Then he sees it. At first, he thinks his eyes are playing tricks. His reflection does not mimic his movements as expected, it lags slightly, a fraction of a second behind, and when he raises his hand, the image in the glass hesitates before following. Panic surges through him as he realizes the reflection is not entirely his own. Behind it, faint and pale, stands the child from the photograph, small and trembling, just as he had been beside the window more than a century ago. The child's eyes are wide with fear, fixed not on the historian but on something deeper within the shadows beyond the glass. The historian's stomach tightens as he notices the reflection's subtle differences, the terrified expression, the slight tremor of shoulders, the way the figure seems almost tethered to the window itself rather than to the room he occupies. A low, almost imperceptible whisper grazes the edge of his awareness, the same fragile voice he had heard before, calling his name with desperate urgency. He realizes that this is not a memory frozen in time. This is something still alive, still aware, still bound to the window and the forest outside. The reflection of the child is more than a ghostly image, it is a warning, a tethered presence that refuses to leave, that has waited for anyone to peer too closely into the history it guards. His lantern flickers, casting shadows across the room, and he becomes acutely aware of movement beyond the glass, shapes pressing against the trees, silent silhouettes that watch, patient and persistent. The historian tries to move away, to escape the oppressive weight of the room and the reflection that refuses to obey him, but the presence holds him in place, rooted with a strange magnetism. Every instinct in his body screams to look away, to flee, yet his eyes are fixed on the reflection, on the child who once was and yet somehow still is. It becomes horrifyingly clear that the photograph, the note, the whispering voice, the circling footsteps, and the child in the reflection are all interconnected. The forest, the house, and the window have preserved a moment of terror that transcends time, a vigilance that waits for those who pry too deeply, a memory that refuses to let go, and now, in this moment, the historian is caught within it, becoming part of the same story the child had warned about, bound to the window where the past refuses to remain past.